Hey everyone, welcome to the March 5th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and we've got a lot of racing to discuss from this past weekend, though in addition to the horses that actually did participate, I think we've got to discuss some of the horses that did not participate, as there were many key scratches across the country, just a weird set of circumstances where a bunch of high-profile horses scratched out of stakes races for varying reasons, so we'll kind of discuss that as we go through some of these stakes events, some of which went without horses that would have been short prices. But Craig, we did have some major Derby preps last weekend. I'm not sure that they provided the amount of clarity to this Derby picture that we were hoping, because some horses that we were expecting to see, we ultimately did not get to see. But there were some nice performances, and we'll go through them towards the beginning of this podcast.
Seems like one of those years where it's just going to be kind of a wide open Derby all the way up to the first Saturday in May. We're just not really getting those kind of performances from horses that are eligible that really stand out. We'll talk about the speed figures, but nothing really stands out there. And let's just say the scratches were almost more the story than the horses that actually ran, though I do think we saw a couple good performances.
On this podcast, we're going to begin by going through those Derby and Oaks preps towards the top of the show. Then we'll go track by track to wrap up some stakes action and high-profile speed figures from around the country. After that, we'll discuss the Saturday action from Gulfstream on the undercard of the Fountain of Youth. We'll move on to Santa Anita to discuss a couple of stakes on their big cap card from a Sunday. And then we'll discuss some other stakes action from Aqueduct, Tampa, Fairgrounds, and Oaklawn towards the end of the show. But let's begin by discussing those Derby and Oaks prep races, Craig. And I think the one that most people were looking forward to heading into the weekend was the Grade 2 Fountain of Youth, because the race was drawn like it was going to be a real test for some horses that we were looking forward to seeing kicking off their 3-year-old campaigns. Obviously, Dornoch, who did participate, but there was also Locked in the field. Speakeasy and Victory Avenue had been entered from that very fast maiden race on the Pegasus World Cup undercard. However, those last three that I mentioned all ended up not making it to the starting gate.
Yeah, it was kind of ugly. We had a couple early scratches we knew about. Locked. Hopefully he's going to run again soon. Victory Avenue. Merritt ran in the allowance race. But then Speakeasy was the horse who, just something happened. I guess he got loose in the pre-race. Maybe it would help if they didn't drag the post so much, but that's for another day, I guess. But turned out to be pretty disappointing. Just a 5-horse field, couple of long shots in there, 1-5 door knock. And I saw some knocking of his race, but I really don't think there's anything to knock. It just wound up basically being kind of a paid workout. He did exactly what he was supposed to do. I don't think you want to leave it all on the track in the first Saturday in March. So I thought he ran fine, but I don't think we learned a whole lot one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, I'll get to Dornoch in just a second. I don't know exactly what happened with Speakeasy. At first, it sounded like he dropped the rider, but then reading it again and the reporting, I don't know if Irad ever was off his back. It seemed like he maybe just lost control of the horse and accidentally bumped into the rail and he got a laceration. I think that's what happened, but it was hard to know, and I don't think there was any video of it that I saw. But unfortunately, he's out, and it sounds like Speakeasy is going to be out of training for a little bit as he needs some time to recover from whatever cuts he got in that incident. So unfortunately, it seems like it's going to be really hard for a horse like that, who only has one start under his belt, to get back on the Derby trail at this point, unless they're going to just try to make it in one prep race. We'll see if they try to do that. Victory Avenue and Locked, it seems like the narrative around those two horses is suddenly quite similar. Both scratched for somewhat mysterious reasons. Victory Avenue just apparently not doing as well as they had hoped, and Locked, it sounded like he just wasn't himself on the morning of the race when he galloped. Potentially he can bounce back from that. Pletcher said he was already doing better on Sunday morning, though Pletcher also ruled out the possibility of wheeling back in a week in the Tampa Bay Derby. So that kind of puts their back up against the wall, and now all of these horses can only qualify for the Derby by contesting a 100-point prep race in that final round. So I think it just creates some uncertainty about whether or not those horses are going to be able to make the Kentucky Derby starting gate. And especially that's a big deal for Locked, who I think you could fairly argue was among the most talented 2-year-olds that we saw last year. And now it seems like we've got to face the possibility that he might not be able to make the start again on the first Saturday in May. So it's going to be interesting to see how that all develops. Obviously, Dornoch was the one whose prep race did go according to plan. He got the job done. I'm sure that Danny Gargan was quite relieved that there were some key scratches in this race, because I'm not sure that we saw Dornoch at his sharpest here. And I think Gargan kind of alluded to the fact that he might not have had him fully cranked for this race. But I guess you could ask yourself, Craig, is Dornoch just not the kind of horse that is going to draw off and win impressively? Because he does have that tendency to get a little goofy, to hang on his wrong lead. We saw that again here at the top of the stretch. He tends to wait on his competition a little bit. So I guess if you're viewing this return effort through that lens, maybe it's not so disappointing. Though I think you do want to see these horses at least get back to as good as they were as 2-year-olds when they return as 3-year-olds. And personally, I didn't see quite as much from Dornoch in this performance as I feel like I did in the Remsen or even his maiden score from last year.
I would agree. I mean, I was kind of nice to him. It wasn't the best performance, that's for sure. As you know, he ran a 116 TimeformUS speed figure when he won the Remsen. Only got a 113 here. It was a pretty weirdly run race from a pace figure scenario, as he was going pretty slow early, just a 105 in the couple early fractions, and then he really got pressed by Ladom Bro, that speed figure at the 6 furlong mark, up all the way to a 117. So that's some real running there. He was able to put Ladom Bro away, won pretty easily, but it's not like he was flying to the finish. The pace speed figures and speed figures started tailing off a little bit, all the way down to a 111 final time. So, I mean, off this effort, don't get me wrong, I'm not, as a contender for the Derby, I still think he's kind of viable, but that said, he's not a horse I would be looking to bet wherever he shows up next, be it the Florida Derby or Bluegrass or whatever it is. I haven't looked to see where he's going to go, but it wasn't the most visually appealing win, particularly given the competition.
Yeah, and I think you have to remember that Ladom Bro, who was second, is not even nominated to the Triple Crown, nor is the third place finisher Frankie's Empire. And Ladom Bro was also the same horse that was 9th in the Remsen, beaten 30 lengths by Dornoch. So definitely narrowed the gap here. And obviously that runner-up has improved a lot since his 2-year-old season. But still, I think people were expecting Dornoch to really put on a show based on what was left of this field. And that just didn't happen. And personally, I mean, when I was doing my line for Derby Watch this week, I actually raised his price for the Derby, despite the fact that he won last weekend, because I think it left a bit of a sour taste in some people's mouths. So we'll see how he is able to progress from start 1 to start 2 of his 3-year-old campaign, because I think we're expecting to see a step forward in that final round prep race. Let's talk about another prep, Craig, that I think got people a little bit more excited, and that was the Grade 3 Gotham, the final race on Saturday at Aqueduct. And whether or not you think that the Gotham is a productive prep race for the Kentucky Derby, especially since they turned it back to be a 1-turn mile, I think you have to be pretty impressed with what Deterministic was able to do off this lengthy layoff. A horse who had only 1 start under his belt as a 2-year-old, coming back with all that experience and handling this 11-horse Gotham field that was run over a really messy racetrack, and to win in the way he did. This guy's got a lot of talent.
No doubt about it. I mean, he flashed that in his debut at Saratoga, and that was a race which, if memory serves right, has come back pretty strong. A lot of winners have come out of that race, and he's been unsighted ever since. But when he came back, boy, was he good in this one. Not a lot of hesitation with this. He's a good horse. He's got a long way to go to get to the Derby gate, though. I mean, I guess he can get in just with the points from this race, but he still has to go 2 turns. He's going to be very lately seasoned. So I'm not sure what to make of him just yet, but he does have some talent. I did want to talk a little about the speed figure. I wound up giving him a 113 TimeformUS speed figure. It should be noted there was a complete breakout from the rest of the day. The rest of the day I had the variant varying a little bit. It was faster early for the first 4 or 5 races. Then it got kind of slow. And then for whatever reason, the Gotham track seemed to be much faster, which isn't unusual on a sloppy track. Doesn't take much to change the speed of those races. And had I used the variant for the prior 3 or 4 races, I mean, the top 4 horses would have all been running like 124 to 126 TimeformUS speed figures. That was just a little bit too much to take. So I think it's a pretty clear-cut case where the track was different. Maybe the horses ran a little faster. I would have no argument with that, but I think breaking it out was definitely the right call.
100%. And it's never a surprise when the speed of a track is changing, as it is constantly enduring rainfall throughout the card. That was the case on Saturday at Aqueduct. I mean, the rain was just coming down nonstop. I mean, some races were almost a little bit hard to see because the rain was falling so hard. I think that it's difficult to just compare the final time of this race to, let's say, the Stymie, which was run at the same distance a couple of races earlier. And we'll talk about that race in a little bit later in the podcast when we get to Aqueduct. But as for deterministic, I think he just really had to like the professionalism that he showed in this race, despite being so inexperienced. Joel Rosario felt comfortable giving him that education, sitting behind horses from his inside post position right from the start of the race, angled between runners in the stretch, and was able to produce that kick. And I think the runner-up in this race, Just the Touch, actually ran pretty well. I mean, he ran back to his maiden score at just a repeating that speed figure of a 110. But he was just a little bit one-paced in the late stages, getting up for second, whereas the Deterministic was able to produce that kick, which is not something that you often see over a messy, sloppy racetrack like this at Aqueduct. So all good signs for Deterministic. And really now, I think we know what kind of quality he possesses. He just has to answer that 2-turn question. And, you know, his pedigree on the bottom side gives some mixed signals, but he's by Liam's Map, who can be a sire of runners that go all variety of surfaces and distances. So I'm really intrigued to see where this horse goes in the future. We should note, Christophe Clement, believe it or not, has never started a horse in the Kentucky Derby before, which is kind of mind-boggling given that he's operated towards the top of this game for as long as he has. But I think that it speaks to the fact that it's not really part of his program. I think he's got a horse that might take him there this year.
Yeah, that surprises me. I actually had no idea that was the case, but obviously I wasn't able to think of one. So if there are none, that makes sense. Question for you. He was a little wide around the turn, kind of drifted out to make his run. Not a bad drift out, just to be clear. Anything on the sloppy track you noted as far as any preferred paths or anything like that? Because if not, losing ground around the turn certainly would bolster his resume a little too.
I mean, he was not nearly as wide as some others in this race. And I think in general, all of the jockeys, well, almost all of the jockeys, maybe not the jockey of the horse that I bet on in this race, but most of the jockeys were avoiding the inside paths, and not just the rail path, but like the inside 3 paths for most of this day, especially as we got later into this card. It just seemed like you did not want to be down towards the inside. And that makes sense. When it's raining throughout the day, the water drains off towards the inside of the track. So I think a lot of jockeys just knew to not go down there. And I mean, the horse that was widest of all in this race was Just the Touch. I mean, he was out like the 8 or 9 path for most of his trip. And I don't think that really worked against him, because you probably wanted to be way off the rail. But I mean, he was just kind of staying on, plugging away at the end, got past El Grandeo, who actually ran pretty well. El Grandeo just keeps showing up with these solid efforts, picking up pieces in races. But Just the Touch and Deterministic feel like the two from this Gotham that could have a say potentially in a final round Derby prep. I still think Just the Touch is the kind of horse that's going to want some more ground. We'll see if he can take a step forward from these first 2 starts to begin his career when he comes back for his final prep for the Derby.
And I did want to mention the pace figures a little bit. Deterministic, he was not up on the pace. He was maybe 1.5 lengths to 2 lengths off most of the way, but it was a race without a lot of pace. We don't have any color coding, but it was a race where the pace figures were and speed figures were definitely increasing as the race went on.
Now, the fastest prep race of the weekend for the 3-year-olds as it relates to the Kentucky Derby was actually out in California on Sunday, the Grade 2 San Felipe, which was originally scheduled to be Saturday, of course, but moved to Sunday due to forecasted rain on that big cap card. And Craig, a little surprising, at least to me, that this race got as high of a speed figure as it did, with Imagination just gutting it out over his stablemate Wind Me Up, because this race was not the most aesthetically pleasing to watch. There was a bit of trouble into that clubhouse turn. Bob Baffert really getting all the best of it in that situation, as the two others not trained by him had some trouble into the clubhouse turn. But I guess both of these horses ran pretty well. It's just hard to know what to make of these races when they're just running against their stablemates.
Yeah, I mean, a 4-horse field, even though there was some trouble at the beginning, it's not like you're going to have a lot of trouble in these races for the most part. You're not going to lose ground around the turn. So I think that's part of it. But I also think the Bob Baffert horses are pretty good. Wind Me Up was second to Nisos last time, a distant second, but had improved his speed figure quite a bit. And he kind of backed that up here. There were 2 other routes on the card, so it's not like this race was run in isolation. It was a pretty quick race. I don't know if you want to say it's good news or bad news, is we don't have to worry about it as far as the Derby goes, because once again, very few points will be handed out from this race. And it seems like we're not going to have any California horses in the Kentucky Derby unless they ship out and go somewhere else and get some points.
It really does seem that way. It's no surprise. I mean, Bob Baffert has just cleaned up all of the graded stakes out in California. I think my colleague or our colleague Brad Free wrote over the weekend that of all of the graded stakes on the dirt for 3-year-olds and previously 2-year-olds from last year, for this entire crop in California, Bob Baffert has won all of them except for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, where of course he was second to Fierceness with Muth. But I mean, when you have that level of dominance, it just shuts out every other horse who's trained by different connections. That's just the way it is. Bob Baffert clearly has a monopoly on this division out west. And when Churchill Downs banned Bob Baffert, they basically have shut out the entire California division from producing a Derby horse this year. We saw one of them, Stronghold, go to Sunland Park to get some minor points in the Sunland Derby earlier last month. I think that was only a 20-point prep this year. So we'll see if a 3-year-old from California goes elsewhere, but I don't know who that would be, Craig, because Bob Baffert has all the good 3-year-olds in California. So who's going elsewhere to get the points that can actually earn them? I don't know who that is. And, kind of looking at Bob Baffert's 3-year-old roster, I mean, he's got these two, Imagination, Wind Me Up, who most would really regard as his B team, because Imagination just lost to May Moon, who we're probably going to see in a race like the Santa Anita Derby for Bob Baffert. Waiting in the wings, of course, is Nisos, who's pointing to, I guess, the Santa Anita Derby. Maybe he'll ship him elsewhere. I don't think other connections would be too happy about that if Bob Baffert spread out his 3-year-olds, but he certainly could do that. And there's also Muth, who I do think missed a work this last week, so I don't know exactly what his status is, but he's got a pretty deep bench out there, so we'll see if he's able to take some more potential points that others could accrue off the table in that final round of prep races.
Yeah, I guess Nisos was the original plan. Was they said they were going to just run in the Santa Anita Derby, but who knows? I mean, he could ship out and go somewhere else, and why wouldn't he? There's some big purse races out there outside of California, and it wouldn't make much sense to me to run all these big horses against each other. So I won't be surprised if he shows up in some of the other preps, particularly Oaklawn, which is going to be huge purse for the Arkansas Derby. So I'm just speculating. We'll see, but there's just a lot of good Bob Baffert horses. So I would imagine it's not the last we're going to hear from him in Kentucky Derby preps.
Yeah, and I'm not reading too much into the fact that Niso scratched out of this race. Frankly, I was really surprised to see him entered, and I think a lot of people were, and maybe Bob Baffert caught wind of that and then kind of reevaluated his decision himself, because like you were saying, doesn't make a whole lot of sense to run in this race when just a month later you've got races with purses towards or upwards of $1 million that you could potentially run in instead. If your ultimate goal is to get that horse to a race like the Preakness, there are just more logical stepping stones than the San Felipe in the first weekend in March. So I imagine that's all that's really going on with Nisos, and it's not a little. There's no conspiracy theory that you want to apply to that situation, at least not right now, based on what we know. Let's talk about the one other Derby prep from last weekend, Craig, that offered points. That was the John Battaglia Memorial won by Encino at Turfway Park. Obviously, this race run on synthetic, this being a prep for the Jeff Ruby Stakes, though the Jeff Ruby usually attracts shippers from all different circuits for horses switching from dirt and turf, and it's not just those that have been competing in that Turfway route to the Jeff Ruby. So we'll see if this proves to be a productive prep. But the winner of this race, Encino, does seem to be a promising sort for Brad Cox.
He certainly took a step forward on this day, all the way up to a 113 TimeformUS speed figure, which is the same as the other horses that won races where they're actually going to get points. So I don't really have any inkling as to whether he could be a dirt horse. His breeding certainly seems to point like he could be fine, being by Nyquist out of a Bernardini mare. Have to do a little more research on that, but I actually liked what I saw when I watched the replay. The speed figure made sense. It was a track at Turfway that kind of changed a couple times, not unusual for the synthetic surfaces. So if you compare it to the older horse stake, it probably would look faster than it really was, in my opinion, but still, it was a good effort and a big jump forward for a 3-year-old. And I'll be interested to see what Brad Cox does with this one. It's not like we haven't seen horses come off synthetic surfaces and run well in the Derby before.
Yeah, it's very true. We've actually seen some real success in the past couple of years with both Two Phils and Rich Strike, of horses coming out of that Turfway route to the Kentucky Derby. And yeah, this horse got a big pace upgrade from his final time fig, which I think was just a 105 to get this 113 TimeformUS speed figure. And that's because he was finishing best of all in a race that did feature a moderate pace. It was not a slow pace by any means, but he really was finishing with greater speed than the others across the wire after getting a bit of a wide trip from an outside post. So this horse ran well, definitely ran the best of anybody in this race. The runner-up Epic Ride, probably just a little bit distance challenged as he was stretching out to the mile in the 16th. Encino certainly bred to relish a race like the Kentucky Derby. As you noted, he's by Derby winner Nyquist. His dam is actually a half-sister to Street Sense, a Derby winner. So there's definitely dirt in the pedigree. We'll see if they try dirt next time or just try to take that Jeff Ruby route to the Derby. But this horse does seem like he's got some potential. Let's now talk about a couple of the Oaks preps that were run last weekend. Now, the Grade 2 Devona Dale, this was supposed to be the 3-year-old debut of Just FYI, the 2-year-old filly champion from last year. Like others this weekend, she had some bad luck of not feeling well on the day as she had a temperature and was scratched from this race. Bill Mott doesn't sound too concerned. I think getting in 2 preps for the Oaks is viewed as a little bit less important than it is for the male horses pointing toward the Derby. We've seen horses just get in 1 prep for the Oaks and do just fine in recent years. So it sounds like they're just going to point to a final round prep race with Just FYI. But as for the horses that did participate in the Devona Dale, Craig, we saw a minor upset here as Fiona's Magic, the local horse, was able to get the job done going the 1-turn mile. The disappointment, of course, was Leslie's Rose, who maybe didn't get the ideal trip, but also you could argue was a little disappointing.
Yeah, I would say I didn't get this horse being 1-5, and maybe that's just the TimeformUS speed figures didn't really have her with any particular edge over the winner, for example, who went off 9-1 compared to that 1-5. But I guess the final time figures were better. I'll be honest, I would have been furious had I played a pick 5 and with a late scratch of Just FYI got stuck with Leslie's Rose at 1-5. Seemed a little odd to me that a horse who was scratched for being sick wasn't announced till the middle of the card. So as an industry, we need to do better with those kind of situations. As for the race, it was fine. Like you said, it lost some luster with the scratch of Just FYI. Fiona's Magic ran a decent race, got a 104 TimeformUS speed figure, a slight improvement. And to be honest, about what we've been seeing from this 3-year-old filly crop. So I don't want to knock her too much. It was just a 1-turn race, but I can't keep saying every week that it's a slow speed figure when it's what everybody's running. So good effort from her. Like you said, maybe some trouble from Leslie's Rose, but not the strongest group after the scratch.
Yeah, and I think that's the reason why Leslie's Rose was such a heavy favorite in here, Craig. Because if you're just using final time speed figures, and even if you look at the final time numbers in Timeform US, she had run final times that made her one of the fastest three-year-old fillies in the country. And obviously, when you're looking at the Timeform US speed figures, she got some big pace downgrades for those races because she was competing in two very slow-paced races. And I think you do want to pay attention to that stuff when horses are coming out of one-turn races and they've had all the best of it from a pace standpoint. Maybe their speed figures from a final time standpoint are a little bit inflated. I think that there's some truth to that. And I think there's also some truth to Leslie's Rose didn't get the best ride or trip in here. I think Arad Ortiz was a little overconfident with her, just sort of trusting an inexperienced horse to want to go through this really tight spot on the inside. He sort of forced himself to be glued to the rail in upper stretch when it's more of a typical Irad move to sort of force his way to the outside with a horse like this, and he elected not to do it. And I don't know if it cost this horse the race, Craig, because she ended up losing by 2 1/4 lengths. But with an inexperienced horse like this, I think that is a little bit of an excuse. She was still somewhat disappointing to get beaten by a couple of horses who were coming in with comparable speed figures, but I think most felt that she was supposed to beat those runners. So it definitely kind of put the exclamation point on the rough weekend for Todd Pletcher, who had disappointments with not seeing his horses run and then seeing one of his most high-profile horses lose at a very short price like this. I mean, he won races on Saturday at Gulfstream, and including some nice races, but I think some horses that he was most looking forward to getting going did not deliver in the afternoon. So put some doubt around Leslie's Rose's status as a Kentucky Oaks horse, I would say. Fiona's Magic, I don't know if she's really an Oaks horse. She kind of strikes me as more of a one-turn type. She got it done here, setting what was a pretty moderate pace. Hard to read too much into her pedigree because, I mean, she's by St. Patrick's Day out of a Factum mare. Not names that everyone's too familiar with. Kind of oddly, St. Patrick's Day is the full brother to American Pharoah, and Factum is a half brother to Warfront. So just sires that are basically standing in stud because of who their relatives are. But they produced a decent one here in Fiona's Magic. Just not sure how far this one's going to want to go down the line.
Yeah, if I wanted one horse out of this race, it would probably be the runner-up into Champagne. Granted, she had every chance to go by the winner and couldn't quite do it, but it was only her third start. She's gotten significantly better Timeform US speed figures every time out, up to a 103. And I wouldn't rule out, I know she's an Into Mischief in a Speightstown, but I don't see why she couldn't get 2 turns watching her run.
And then we'll wrap up the Oaks and Derby preps from this week that offered points to the winners with the Busher Stakes for the 3-year-old fillies. This one a prep for the Kentucky Oaks going the 1-turn mile at Aqueduct over that messy, sloppy track on Saturday. And Jody's Pride, Craig, she actually did come back and deliver and exceed her 2-year-old form. One of the few horses that was able to do that this weekend, as she was the upset second place finisher behind Just FYI in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies last year. And she came back and proved that performance was no fluke by getting her 3-year-old campaign started off on a positive note.
Yeah, it's kind of bizarre. I mean, I would guess she has to be at the top of the division with this race. I mean, she won easily. She got a 109 Timeform US speed figure, so a nice effort. She handled the slop. She's a filly who's just run every time, and maybe it was actually a good thing for their connections that she was reined off the turf 2 different times, because she sure looks like a very good dirt filly.
Yeah, I mean, she just keeps passing these tests. She's got a lot of heart to her. I wouldn't say that she necessarily strikes me as a horse that's going to love going a mile and an eighth on the dirt just based on her pedigree and physicality, but she keeps running well in these races, so you can't really knock her. And I imagine we'll go on to a race like the Gazelle. Jorge Abreu has tried to use that path in the past, and I would imagine she's going to be one of the favorites in that race. So we'll see if she's able to pass that next test, but she's definitely doing everything right up until this point. And this division is particularly wide open right now, and she has been consistent, and we can't say that about everybody. So I think she's definitely in a good spot, at least at this point in time. Let's move on to some track-by-track discussion, and we'll kick that off with Gulfstream Park as we wrap up all of that stakes action from the Fountain of Youth undercard. We already mentioned that 3-year-old prep race for the males, as well as the Devona Dale. There was also another race going the 1-turn mile distance for the older horses. That was the Grade 2 Gulfstream Park mile. Small field here, Craig, and sort of a different race flow than what we were expecting when we handicapped this race, because it didn't look like there was a whole lot of speed on paper. But I think that got it in some riders' heads, particularly Il Miracolo with Javier Castellano aboard, that he would be intent on getting to the front end and securing an early advantage on that horse. And I think it just created a faster pace that we were anticipating, and it just set it up for Steel Sunshine to come from off the pace again.
Yeah, that's one of those where sometimes maybe people, and I'm not saying the jockeys looked at the pace projector, but looked at the PPs, saw very little speed on paper, and both made up their minds they were going to the front, because even though we don't have any of the fractions coded in red, the early figures were in the 130s, and Il Miracolo and Tumbarumba were just throwing it down, going at it, and you could just see the whole way they were setting it up for Steel Sunshine. And Tumbarumba was really game to the wire to almost hold that one off, but Steel Sunshine was able to get the job done, ran a 120 TimeformUS speed figure. Tumbarumba actually got a 121, 1 point higher in defeat. So I thought he was the best horse in the race, just a good setup for Steel Sunshine, but pretty quick race for these horses.
Yeah, Tumbarumba is so game. I mean, you could see he does not like to lose these photos. When a horse comes to him, he really tries not to let them pass. And he's been involved in a number of photos in his career, and he usually comes out on the right end of them. Not so here, as Steel Sunshine was just able to nip him on the wire, even though Tumbarumba was trying to come back at the end. But good setup for the winner. And not sure that this race is going to, matter so much moving forward in this particular division, because I think we're going to see some better horses that maybe competed overseas that are going to come back and be more dominant against these down the line. But they earned a respectable speed figure for this effort. Let's move on to some of the turf action from Saturday at Gulfstream Park. The Grade 2 Mac Diarmida was won, big surprise, by a Mike Maker trainee, as one of the bigger prices of his runners in here, starting over, got the job done. This horse that was actually second at a really big price in the McKnight in his prior start, but like so many Mike Maker horses, I think he proved here that he's just really taken a step forward since getting stretched out to these marathon distances.
Yep, we've talked about it many times. I think he had 3 in here, so you had to get the right one, but you always have to take these Mike Maker horses seriously. He ran a 121 TimeformUS speed figure, which is a career best for a 7-year-old gelding and career start number 24. So he certainly has him going in the right direction. We'll see where he shows up next, but these horses are always dangerous until you see signs they're tailing off, because this one is in career best form and no reason to think he won't hold it.
Yeah, I mean, we say over and over again, or people do, how did he do it? How did Mike Maker turn this horse's form around? Well, I mean, nobody had really tried going longer with him before. I mean, once early in his career, his prior trainer, Rob Falcone, had stretched him out to 1.25 miles in the San Marcos, back when this horse was 4-year-old, and now he's 7, and that was actually the best performance of his career, the best effort that he put forth for Rob for a really long time. And not since the switch to Mike Maker did he try to go further than that, and he's really taken a liking to it. This horse is in good form right now. Can't really say that he had perfect trips in either of these races. He just proved to be the best horse on the day. Tawny Port, who the runner-up in here, Craig, I thought this was a good effort for him coming back off the layoff for Christophe Clement. He's a horse that did take a step forward and gain some level of consistency since getting on the turf last year. He had been a good dirt horse early in his career for Brad Cox, and he's one that I could see having some upside after starting his campaign on this positive note.
Yeah, I agree. He really seems to like these longer distances. I think I had actually liked him in the Sycamore back at Keeneland in October. He didn't have the greatest trip that day, got some time off, and I thought he ran fine. And he's a horse who runs quite a bit, so I imagine we'll be seeing him more as the year goes on.
Todd Pletcher was not shut out from winning graded stakes on this Saturday card at Gulfstream. He did take down the grade 3 Canadian with Emmanuel, who was a deserving favorite in this race, Craig, and just delivered his typical good effort. He's a horse that, we talked about it on the forecast last week. He runs well fresh, and he delivered one of his good efforts off the layoff here. He had kind of tailed off a little bit in the middle of his 2023 season, went to the sidelines, but seems to be back in form in this race and held off a game Siege of Boston, who just got rolling a little bit too late. That horse is going to have a stakes victory on his resume at some point. It hasn't come quite yet. He keeps picking up minor awards, but I thought both of the top two and really all of the top three ran well in this race.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Emmanuel, it was pretty predictable as we had talked about, and I would predict he'll probably run well next time too, because he's done that in his career. He comes off the bench well fresh, and he keeps it going for a little while. So until you see signs he's going to tail off, he's probably worth following for a little bit. It was a good, strong race. Emmanuel got a 123 TimeformUS speed figure, so good, solid number, one that we've seen from him in the past, and I would expect that we'll see it again.
And I do want to mention the third place finisher, Ice Shock a lot, who might have had the toughest trip of anybody because he was out wide the entire way, 3 to 4 wide, even watching the head on, had no cover for most of the race. So that's a tough trip to pull on the turf, especially at Gulfstream Park. And he actually did really well to be third, beaten just over a length in this race. So there's an argument he ran the best race of anybody. And he's the kind of horse that would really appreciate getting in a race with just a little more pace than he received on Saturday. So the top three are all really nice horses, and we'll see if they're able to come back with these kind of efforts and some tougher spots in the future. Let's move on to the race right after the Canadian. That was the Grade 3 Honey Fox, going the same 1 mile distance, but for the fillies and mares. And this one played out almost exactly like we thought it would on the forecast last week, Craig. Plenty of pace signed on. It developed on the track as a couple of the speeds just ran off through fast fractions, and it really set it up for the favorite Chili Flag, who was able to deliver it 2-1.
Yeah, it was a nice, well-timed ride by Rad Ortiz. She got the job done, ran a 117 TimeformUS speed figure, and also want to note Walkathon. She's better than I've been giving her credit for. She's versatile. She shows up every time, and another good race from her as well.
Yeah, I agree. Walkathon, nice to see her adapt to use a different running style than when she was quite fortunate setting a slow pace in her prior start at Tampa Bay Downs. So it does seem like Ian Wilkes has really finally gotten her back into good form after she was so promising as a 3-year-old. Chili Flag, I don't think she's necessarily so much better than these horses, Craig. She just got the right kind of trip and ride and pace set up in this race. Do want to give a shout out to the third place finisher, Ancient Peace, because she was put in the difficult spot of having to chase those two runoff leaders and actually struck the lead briefly in mid-stretch before getting run down by those two closers, but just not the ideal trip for a horse like that probably wants to lead herself. There's an argument that she ran just as well as the winner, and I think it'll be interesting to see who really comes out on top if these horses come together next time in a race that features a different pace scenario.
Yeah, I didn't mention most of the fractions are coded in red. Time Passage, who was the long shot, was out there going really quick, and not alone either for the flag. One of the contenders in the race on paper was kind of dueling with her, tracking her. They opened up a gap, so not the best position that Ancient Peace was in, that kind of chase position. And I agree, she ran well, and the speed figures show it. She got the same 117 that the winner did.
Another race that was significantly affected by pace was the Grade 3 Here Comes the Bride for the 3-year-old fillies on the turf. And this one was won in a bit of an upset by the Mark Casse trained Pounce, who somewhat surprisingly closed from last to first, even though she was a horse that had gone gate to wire in her turf debut in just her prior start. But it was a smart decision by Javier Castellano to play the break, realized that he was breaking from an outside post, needed to save ground, to take her right to the back of the pack because the pace really did heat up in front of him. And it turned out that making the last move was the right move in this spot.
No doubt about it. I mean, it was a heck of a ride by Javier Castellano. She wound up with a 106 TimeformUS speed figure in the TimeformUS chart. You can see it was a faster race time-wise than that. She got a 115 final time figure, but that pace was so quick. we knocked it down a little bit because of that. And I think rightfully so. And you can just look at the top 4 finishers. Most of them were pretty far off the pace. The favorite Ozara was the one who was closest up and was only beaten, I think, about a half length. I thought she ran very well. And if anybody wanted to make the argument she was best horse in the race, I wouldn't argue with them. But we got some pretty good fillies in the top 3 finishers here.
Yeah, Ozara is a horse that you really do have to time her move perfectly because she's got a really short spurt and she doesn't typically sustain it in her races. And especially in a race like this that features a really fast pace, if she hits the front too soon, she's not going to be able to finish it off. And she proved vulnerable to both Life's Inaudible, who got a better trip as the runner-up, but also Pounce, who was probably just a little better than the runner-up on the day, though it did help that she was making that last move and was ridden so patiently. But also credit to this filly because she really did not have that experience coming from as far back as she did in this race. And I mean, Javier forced her to go through some tight spots around the far turn, coming inside of tiring runners one by one, and she really was able to deliver that kick when she got to the outside in the stretch. So really nice effort from her. But like you said, I think it's the right call to downgrade this race slightly from the final time number because it's just a little hard to believe that all of these fillies would have stepped up with the career best effort. So I think you did get this speed figure spot on, Craig. Let's move on to a race that was actually run on Friday at Gulfstream Park. That was an allowance race, the 7th on the card, won by Conquest Warrior, who I know the connections and Shug McGahee were sort of debating whether to go to this N1X allowance race or onto the Fountain of Youth. And maybe in retrospect, they would have hoped they ended up in the Fountain of Youth starting gate because I don't think this horse would have had much trouble picking up a big check and some valuable points in that spot, given the way everything transpired. But I think they still got what they wanted out of Conquest Warrior's effort last weekend, just to get a nice, easy 2-turn test under his belt. Clearly, he was beating up on inferior competition, but from a visual standpoint, you had to like what you saw.
Watching this race on Friday, I was impressed by what I saw. I mean, the speed figure didn't come back earth-shattering. He's going to get a 107. But I really liked what I saw from this horse. He looked very professional. He looked like a horse who can probably run all day. And I expect this horse to be good. Now, he's up against it from a Derby standpoint. I assume he'll get a shot in a race like the Florida Derby to get points, and who knows where we'll go from there. But Shug McGahee's pretty patient guy, so I guess we'll just have to see. But this is a horse over the year. I expect good things from him.
Yeah, I mean, the TimeformUS speed figure was only a 107. It really was not much of a step forward from his maiden victory, where I would argue he actually beat a tougher field in his maiden special weight race 2 back, given the runbacks from that race and how potent that field has been in subsequent starts. But he looked good winning, Craig. I mean, went the mile in an 8th distance and not just winning the race, but he really finished powerfully. And I'm not going to make so much of the fact that he was geared down the final yards of this race that I'm not going to say that he could have run so much faster just because Jose Ortiz dropped his hands in the last 50 yards. But I mean, this horse always traveled professionally. He showed that professionalism when he broke his maiden, overcoming a slow start to work his way through traffic. Obviously a much softer trip this time, but the way that he just, has this large scopy frame and length at his stride, you really do get the vibe that these distances work for him. And I think you just wanted to see him put that all together going this 2-turn distance, and he did that. Now he's got to step up against tougher next time, but he's certainly being brought along in the way that Shug McGahee likes to bring along his horses. He wasn't tempted too much by trying to get those Derby points earlier. He's going to get them when he feels like the horse is ready to earn them, and that's next time, probably in the Florida Derby. So we'll see if he's able to be successful in that spot. And one more race I want to mention from Gulfstream last weekend, Craig, was actually one of the first races on that Saturday card, race 2, a maiden special weight event, won by the Todd Pletcher trained BU, a horse that they asked a lot of last year, even though he was only a maiden, trying grade 1 races twice in a row after just barely losing his debut by a nose to Just Steel. Tailed off a little bit early this year, but maybe he's just a horse that didn't want to go that far, even though he's a son of Curlin. They turned him back to 7 furlongs here, and it really seemed to work for this guy.
Yeah, he's been running regularly since Saratoga, and he, like you said, he had kind of tailed off going longer distances. He certainly figured things out on this day, running a 107 time form US speed figure. He had run some fast races before. I mean, he ran a 106 in debut when he was just nosed out by Just Steel. Got a 105 when he was a distant third to Muth, but the last two races, the one to the aforementioned Conquest Warrior last time out, he was in that maiden race. He didn't really do much running, but he looked like a new horse on Saturday. So maybe it was just a turn back in distance, or maybe the light just went on. But I do like what I saw from BU and would expect for some improvement next time out, too.
Well, Todd Pletcher said that next time they're likely to try a Derby prep again, so maybe not. But eventually, I think he's a horse that could do some nice things in one-turn races down the line. We'll see if he's able to overcome what might be a tough spot for him in his next race. Let's move on to Santa Anita, Craig, and discuss a couple of races on that big cap card. We already mentioned the San Felipe. Obviously, the big race was the Santa Anita Handicap on Sunday. And Bob Baffert had a pretty big day in not just dirt races, but a turf race as well, which we'll get to in just a little bit. But his Newgate 4-year-old came back in the third start since commencing this layoff, commencing his campaign after a long layoff. And Bob Baffert has just been gradually stretching out in distance. And even though he's a son of into mischief, he was able to handle 1.25 miles here and beat a decent field, though certainly not the toughest field that we've ever seen assembled for the Santa Anita Handicap.
No, I mean, this race is a grade one in name only. You could look at the field. None of the horses had run a 120 even in their last race. We did get to that on this day as Newgate showed up. He got the job done. He looked like a horse who maybe this is what he was being pointed for all along. His first two races have been pretty good, but not quite as good as this one. So good effort by him. The runner-up really improved Subsanador, I assume is how you say it. He was a horse who went off a heavy favorite in his U.S. debut after shipping in from Argentina. Didn't really show up that day, but he looked like a different horse on this day, going right out to the lead. Actually gets a point higher time form US speed figure with a 121. So decent effort from the top two, but these, in my opinion, are not really grade one horses.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. I mean, this race is really suffered from the advent of the Saudi Cup and Dubai World Cup prior to that. All of the top horses going overseas at this time of year, and just content to miss a race like the Santa Anita Handicap, which used to be the real jewel for the older horses in the early part of the season. And the racing calendar has just really significantly changed since those years, decades ago. So we've seen this race suffer over the years. There was one shipper in this race, Highland Falls, who was an allowance type coming in for Brad Cox, did take some money in this race and ran okay, just sort of ran out of ground, trying to close belatedly at the end. So we'll see if Newgate can continue to move forward, because I think he does still have some upside as a 4-year-old, but he's going to have to get better to get on terms with some of those horses that went to compete in those races overseas over the past few weeks. Let's also talk about Bob Baffert's turf winner, Craig. I mean, I can't remember the last grade one winner that Bob Baffert has had on the turf. I'm sure there's been one before, but probably was decades ago. But he was able to get one here with De Jour in the grade one Frankie Kilroe Mile. And this horse, I think is a 6-year-old now. I mean, he's was once in Bill Mott's barn, back to Bob Baffert. He's run well fresh off layoffs in the past. He can be a little bit inconsistent at times, not really holding that top form for the entirety of a season, but he was an unlucky loser of this race last year and was able to go one place better this year.
Yeah, he's a good horse. When he shows up, I mean, he runs fast speed figures, and he's won a lot of races in his career. He got a 126 for this effort, which I think is the best number of his career, if memory serves. I actually didn't look this one up, but it was a very good race for him. And he's a horse who, when he shows up on his best day, can compete with anybody. I mean, I remember him as a 3-year-old winning a race for Bob Baffert on Derby weekend and won the big 3-year-old turf race then. So he's held his form a long time, and Bob Baffert's done a good job with him. I'd like to hear if any of our listeners know if Bob Baffert has won a grade one on turf. I can't think of one. There probably is one, but as you said, it was likely a long time ago. And it's not like he was beating nothing in here. Easter's been a really good horse for Phil D'Amato. I think he showed up and ran his race, and Dujour was just much better than him.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend about this. I think they mentioned a horse named Tuzla from like the late 90s that Bob Baffert trained, and I believe won a grade one race. She was a mare out in California, but he was having trouble coming up with one since then, and I certainly couldn't. So it might be a couple of decades since Bob Baffert has won a grade one race on the turf. Craig, obviously this horse can't point to the next major grade one in this division, which would probably be the grade one turf classic on Derby Day. There is a grade one at Keeneland that I guess Bob Baffert is eligible for, that being a race at Keeneland and not Churchill Downs. But typically, Bob doesn't seem too inclined to ship these horses out of California. Maybe since it's a turf horse, he'll handle it a little bit differently. But there are plenty of races to support out in California, grade 2 and grade 3 events upcoming. So we'll see where Du Jour goes next. But he definitely seems like, based on this race, he might be a cut above what's currently out there. Though the runner-up Easter, he's been in good form, and he ran well here. Probably had a slightly tougher trip since he had to come around rivals, whereas Du Jour was able to cut inside at the top of the stretch. But at the end of the day, given the margin of victory, I do think that one was only second best. Let's wrap up Aqueduct action. We already talked about the Gotham and the Busher. The one other race that got a noteworthy speed figure on Saturday at Aqueduct was the Stymie. This one, of course, run at the exact same mile distance as those two races that we already talked about. And an exciting finish to this one, Craig, for the older horses. We had three coming to the wire together, and it was the Rick Dutrow-trained Kinetic Sky who was able to bounce back from a disappointing effort in the toboggan in his prior start when he was beaten as the favorite, but stretching back out to the mile under a very savvy ride from Jose Lezcano got the job done.
Yeah, this was a pretty exciting race and turned out to be a pretty good one. Kinetic Sky wound up with a 120 Timeform US speed figure. I think he appreciated the extra distance and just like you said, he bounced back. He needed every inch of that extra distance to run down the leader, Quality Chic, who thought got a really good ride from Ramon Vasquez. I thought that one did about as good as you could on there, showed surprising early speed, was aggressive, and nearly pulled off the upset.
Yeah, that was a tough one for me. I liked Quality Chic quite a bit in that race, and I thought he got a great ride from Ramon Vasquez. I think the only thing that didn't go right is that I think Quality Chic just did not see Kinetic Sky out in the center of the racetrack, because as soon as he engaged him at crossing the wire, Quality Chic ran right past him on the gallop out. But I think that horse was really digging in and was game, getting a very good ride, leading every step of the way when he did not look like the speed on paper. So good rides from the top two. I say good ride for Jose Lezcano because breaking from the rail, he got Kinetic Sky off the inside early and was able to stay out where you wanted to be in the center of the racetrack and close that field down. Both of these horses, for Rick Dutrow, he and Petulante, who was actually the favorite in this race, they were entered back on this Thursday at Aqueduct. They're both going to scratch out of that race. Rick was, I guess, toying with the idea of doing the Willie Beam and willing these horses back quickly, but not going to do that. And it makes sense. I mean, they're stakes quality horses, and I think we'll see them in some tougher spots down the line. Let's quickly go through some races at different venues to wrap up this podcast. Craig did not want to go without mentioning a fast speed figure earned at Tampa Bay Downs on Friday by the Chad Brown-trained Kubrick, who was making his first start for the barn, going out for Peter Brandt, coming in from overseas. And this one is a half-brother to Raging Bull, who these connections had quite a bit of success with. And this one looks like he could be of that quality.
Yeah, the speed figure would certainly point to that, as he's getting a 125 Timeform US speed figure. Now, there was a huge pace upgrade, about as big as we give in here. The final time figure was only a 111, but this horse came from, I think it was near the next to last, maybe early on in a race with all blue fractions. The early pace figures were in the 70s. So a final time speed figure of a good one was pretty much out the window when they went that slow early, but it didn't really matter to this guy, and the bettors weren't fooled. He was 6-5, but I would imagine we're done seeing him in allowance races, as he looks like he's ready for a return to stakes racing.
Yeah, what is that grade one at Keeneland? The Maker's Mile, I think, is the one in the springtime, the grade one event. This feels like a perfect prep for a race like that because this horse might have that kind of quality. I mean, he launched this 3 to 4 wide march around the clubhouse turn, the far turn, I should say, without cover. And once he got into the stretch, I mean, you could see he's not the biggest son of Dubawi. He's pretty compact, but he just has such quick turnover and efficiency to his stride. I mean, the speed with which he finished this race was really impressive. And that's represented in that big pace upgrade he gets in TimeformUS. So I think that figure is deserved, Craig, and I'm really interested to see what this horse does, likely against a graded stakes company next time. We saw another 120 plus TimeformUS speed figure earned at the fairgrounds on Saturday in a race for the Louisiana breds. And looks like there's yet another Louisiana bred out there that's capable of running a fast number. We already saw that from Touch Upon a Star, Tumbarumba, and now this horse Jackhammer put forth a big effort on Saturday, though we do have to note it was over a very wet, muddy track.
It was, but it was another one. I will be honest. I had to go, who the heck is Jackhammer? And I had to look him up because I don't usually make the speed figures for the fairgrounds. I did on this day, though, and it really jumped out at me. He ran a 122 TimeformUS speed figure. And when I looked up his record, I mean, this horse is really good. He's now won 6 out of 8 races. He had a blip where he didn't run very well against some in a Louisiana bred stakes race. It looks like something went wrong that day as he had a 9-month layoff. He came back, didn't run well after that, but he's now won 3 in a row since. So whatever the issue was seems to be a little behind him. It seems like maybe this is pushing the limit for him distance-wise. Kind of everything went his own way this day. Is he was on the front end, or he tracked what was a kind of a moderate pace. It was a horse he was chasing was a distant long shot. And once he put that one away, there was no real competition. But this horse obviously has some real talent. So I just wanted to note him. And we've had quite a few, as you note, of these Louisiana breds running big races of late.
Yeah, this horse is 3 for 3 on wet tracks, and watching the replay of this race, he really seemed like he was striding out well over the wet going in the late stages of the race. Obviously, it was a big effort, but you want to see a horse like this repeat that kind of number on a faster track if they really are going to be of the quality to compete against tougher competition in the future. Though, really only Tumbarumba is the one that's ventured out against graded stakes companies so far, even though we've seen a few of them running speed figures. That would suggest they might have that kind of ability. We'll see where Jackhammer goes in the future. And then one more race as we wrap up this podcast, Craig, to look back at from last weekend was a Sunday optional claiming allowance race for the 3-year-old fillies won by Impel. This a Juddmonte-owned Brad Cox trainee, had won her debut sprinting, was here stretching out for the first time, and passed this test with flying colors and earned the kind of speed figure that suggests that maybe she'll make a late push to get onto the Kentucky Oaks Trail.
Yeah, I mean, she's pretty good. The horse she beat in her maiden win had already come back to win a maiden special weight with a good speed figure. And then Pell got a 106 here, improving a little bit first time around 2 turns. She did it extremely easily, obviously, winning by 8.5 lengths. And she's another, I would assume, stakes will be in her future. And we've talked about the 3-year-old fillies. I mean, a 106 isn't far off the best horses we've seen. We saw Jody's Pride with a 109 this weekend, but she's not that far away from that. So it's a pretty wide open division for lately raced horses like this if they can make that step up in company.
Yeah, I mean, doing it against maiden and allowance competition where you can race on Lasix as a 3-year-old is a different thing than doing it against stakes company. But I'm not sure how tough this division is going to be to break into right before the Oaks. And you would imagine she'll get a shot in a prep race like the Ashland next time out, or potentially the Fantasy. So interested to see what Brad Cox does with this one, because certainly she left a strong visual impression with this decisive victory. Well, Craig, that wraps up all of this action from the first weekend in March. We've got some more Derby preps to look forward to on the horizon this month, including just this upcoming weekend, the Tampa Bay Derby, supposed to be run on Saturday at Tampa. I think we're planning to do that for the forecast this week, talking about the pick 5 there. There are multiple stakes scheduled. I think we'll be doing some previews of those as well on DRF's YouTube channel. So expect that to come out on Friday morning.
Yeah, I look forward to Tampa. They haven't drawn the card yet as we record this, but I'm sure it'll be a good card, and hopefully that is worthy of the forecast because I always like doing the Tampa cards.
Well, everybody, thanks for tuning in to the Pacecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Again, thanks for tuning in this week, and make sure to catch that TimeformUS forecast coming out on Friday.